Welcome back. It's the Big Blue Banter New York Giants football podcast. I'm Dan Schneider, joined as always by my co-host Nick Filato. And today we're here to do a little bit of a new segment we're going to be doing for the next few weeks, 4 weeks before the draft, whatever it is. We'll probably do one of these a week. It's going to be mocking the mock drafts. And we're going to be taking a look at all different kinds of mock drafts around the media landscape and where they have the Giants picking. And then we'll break down their picks. We'll talk about some players they could have taken over them who are still on the board in those mocks and just what we think about those mocks. We're also going to start this podcast off with a little bit of a discussion on an interesting stat that was shared by somebody on Giants Twitter, Giants fan in Charlotte. He shared a very interesting stat on the center position I want to talk about with Nick to kick things off before we get into mocking the mocks. And we've promised in the past that we are going to mock your mocks too. So if you do drop a full mock draft to us or any kind of mock draft, you can do 2 rounds, you can do 1 round, you can do 3 rounds, you can do all 7 rounds if you really like that. And if you do have a mock draft that you want to get talked about or discussed by us, drop it in the iTunes. You can head over to our iTunes, leave a 5-star rating, and in your review, just post anything you want, but make sure you post the mock draft. So if we see a 5-star rating and a mock draft, we will review that mock draft. We have one in today.
Actually, Dan, we have 2 mock drafts because Jack Maxwell also left us how freaking selfish of me to say me when it's us, left us a review on iTunes. So we'll also be going over his mock draft as well. Can't wait to get into that. But let's start with the center discussion.
Yeah, so it's an interesting stat I saw today on Twitter, actually, whenever we're recording this, from Giants fan in Charlotte. And he said and it's a statistic of he looked at remember, we've always talked about, and I mentioned this before, I'll mention it again. Center is one of the only onesie positions you can draft. It's one of the only positions. Now, some of these guys can play into all the interior and offensive line spots, but some of these guys are only true centers that you're thinking about drafting. John Michael Schmitz, maybe he can play guard, but he's mostly only played center. And the list goes on for some of the guys that we're considering for a center for the Giants. So because it's a onesie position, only 32 start in the NFL. So something I thought was interesting. Giant fan in Charlotte took a look at those 32 starters in the NFL and where they were drafted. And the stats show this. The average draft pick for a starting center in the NFL, Nick, is 137 overall, which I thought was wildly much later than people think. He says, or early 4th round. He said Ben Bredesen was pick 143, 17th highest among the projected starters right now. So he's projecting starters as they stand today. Those numbers will change a bit if after the draft, a lot of teams will have new starting centers, or some teams will have new starting centers, I should say. But here's a breakdown of where the starting centers in the NFL were taken. In the first round, picks 1 through 32, only 4 of 32 projected starters in the NFL were selected in the first round. Only 6 of the 32 projected starters were selected in the second round. So that's 10. That's fewer than 33% were selected in the first or second round. 2 were selected in the third round. 4 were selected in the fourth round. 3 were selected in the fifth round. 2 were selected in the sixth round. 5 in the seventh round, which was interesting. It looks like 5 in the sixth round. Might have this 3, 4, 5, 6. Yeah, 5, or he narrows the range there to 161 to 192. 2 picks 193 to 224. 5 of the centers. None were selected in picks 225 to 256, but then 6 of the starting protected centers were actually undrafted rookie free agents, so not drafted at all. What do you make of this breakdown, Nick? Because I will say this, I haven't looked at every position, but this seems awfully late for a position for starting players. I can't imagine you look at too many positions and it's going to be this deep.
I think a lot of just small school guys and people who aren't discussed all that much throughout the draft process get into training camp and they really take to the coaching staff and they develop. And that's great for these small school types of centers. I would like to know where a lot of these guys go in the draft. And again, like you said, this is a onesie position. So if you're Tyler Linderbaum, who is an elite wrestler, who has all the movement skills and athletic ability that can kind of resemble a Jason Kelsey, who was drafted late on day 3, then or a Frank Ragnow, who is a big, powerful, mauling type of guy selected in the first round out of Arkansas back in 2018. Those are 2 of those first round centers that I'm like, I think those guys are going to be successes. In Ragnow's case, he was a success. Linderbaum, that was a first round pick last year. I feel like from what I've heard, he had a solid rookie season. I liked him coming out of the draft, but you can get guys later on as long as you can develop them and hone in on their skill set. It suggests that the Giants aren't going to force a pick at center at 25. Doesn't mean Joe Shane's going to be like, oh, wow, all the other centers, some of them were selected in the 7th round. That means I'm not going to, but it does go down to the argument that you've been bringing up for a while, Dan. It's not necessarily the most crucial position to find right now. Even though if you look at the depth chart of the Giants and you had to pick out one glaring hole, I would say it's more than likely that center position. But just from a positional value standpoint, I think you can make the argument that there are bigger needs on this roster.
Yeah, and I want to make it clear where I stand on this because I saw some YouTube comments that I felt like were not fully understanding my take on this. So that's okay. Maybe it wasn't clear enough the first time. I'll try to make it clear this time. I have no issue taking a center at 25th pick overall in general, right? If there's a guy I think can be that Frank Ragnow type, or even the Tyler Linderbaum, if we wanted a type of move center, I personally wasn't thrilled last year the idea of Linderbaum because I thought there was a chance he could get overpowered at the NFL level. So far, that hasn't been the case. But for a specific scheme, a zone type scheme, I would love to have a Linderbaum type player. Like if you're running a certain scheme and you can find those types of players, or Frank Ragnow who could fit any scheme but is really good in power gap, like that, I'm totally fine taking a center like that at 25. My whole point with not wanting a center this year at 25 is because I don't think any of these centers are worth that pick. And then everyone's like, oh, you need a center because next year you're going to be so mad when Daniel Jones is on his back and he's getting pressure. Agreed, man. I agree we need a center. And Nick just said it best. It is probably the most glaring, obvious need. And I've been saying for a while, I think you should build through the trenches. I've been saying for a while it's important to build inside out, meaning the offensive line over the skill positions. And I've been saying for a while that center, to me, I believe is one of the most underrated positions in the NFL. If and only if you find a true impact player. If you're finding an average starter or even somebody who can play for 10 years at a pretty decent level at center, to me, that doesn't make much of an impact. Ben Jones is a good example. I've seen some people comp Ben Jones to John Michael Schmitz to Ben Jones and saying, like, this is the type of guy you want to draft, like in the mocks that they're picking. In some of the mocks I've seen, and we'll go over a couple today, where somebody mocks John Michael Schmitz to the Giants. They're like, yeah, you can get the next. He kind of reminds me of Ben Jones. Well, Ben Jones is already on the free agent market right now. Right. And Ben Jones was never that much of an impact player at the center position at the NFL level. He was good. He was solid for a little while. For a short term, he was like even considered in that pretty damn good range, not elite range. But that to me is not worth a 25th pick overall when you can get a skill position or a tackle if you needed an offensive tackle. All the money positions, the key positions that make money and where multiple players start at each position throughout the year. Those are the positions you want to invest in overall, unless you can find one of those guys. So that's kind of my take on that. I thought, Nick, it was really interesting just to see how late the starters at this position were taken in the draft. I mean, 6 UDFAs, 5 players selected, 193 to 224. That's crazy to me. 11 of the 32 starters, a third of the starters were selected with the 193rd pick or later.
It also comes down to just the value of John Michael Schmitz, who I really like, and some of these centers who are, well, at least draft pundits believe might be available early on day 3. Like the Michigan center, I'm not going to attempt to say his name. He is first initials O, last initials O. I wish he wore number 7 so he could be 007, but he did not in college. He's somebody that I haven't grinded through his tape, but I've heard really good things about. There's plenty of centers like John Gaines, who was an interior offensive lineman, started at guard last season at a UCLA, very talented player. Luke Whippler, a little bit later, we talked a decent amount about him on a podcast. I might actually be coming out a little bit after this, but that's neither here nor there. So there are other centers in this draft class that the step down between John Michael Schmitz and that player, it might not be that grave. Whereas the step down between a Cam Smith out of South Carolina or a Deontay Banks out of Maryland and the cornerbacks that are going to be around at that time, those are huge steps downs at bigger positions of value. And I think that's why Dan and I are a little dubious at selecting a center at 25. It's really just because what's the glaring gap here? Because I don't believe John Michael Schmitz is really Frank Ragnow per se. I don't think he's quite that. I just think he is a solid foundational center who's going to be a good starter in the league for a little bit, but what's his upside relative to a Joe Tippmann, which we'll also have a podcast on that coming out shortly.
Yeah, and for me, it's about like what's his upside relative to the best centers that come out in every other class, or not even every other, because there's not a lot of them. You don't need it to be every other, but some of the classes, right? Like if you can find a really good center class and there's a Frank Ragnow type, go ahead, trade up, do whatever you got to do to get this guy if you really want this guy. But I don't know, in this kind of draft class where I don't really see it, even like for example, like I had a really interesting interaction in my replies today, Nick, with Stromberg, the center at Arkansas. I know a lot of people really like, and Brandon Thorne, who both you and I really respect for offensive line play. This dude just grinding offensive line film all day, every day. It's his job. was talking up Stromberg, and he was like, really, he's like, yeah, this is one of my guys. And I think it started with Jordan Reed saying, this is one of my guys I plant my flag for. I was like, I got to take a look more into Stromberg, like these two guys saying. And then in the replies, someone was like, yeah, this is the best kept secret. I'm praying the Giants get Stromberg at 57 with their second round pick. And then Thorne, who was like talking about how much he likes him, was like, I think he actually would be a better value later. Like even Thorne is saying things like, nah, Stromberg's good, and I like him a lot. He's one of my guys I'm planting my flag for. But I think the value there is in round 3, not even at 57 in round 2. So I just thought that was really interesting to see a guy who, loves the player, loves the evaluation, but at the same time doesn't even think that type of player at that position is really worth the 57th overall pick.
And every front office, they have all of these prospects tiered off. They know the depth of each of these position groups.
Right.
So they're going to know like, hey, we might need to value player X a little bit more, because if we don't get player X, the drop off from player X to player Z is it's a grave drop off. Whereas, hey, we like player A at the center position, but the drop off between player A and player E, it's not that big of a difference. So Joe Schoen is going to have all of that squared away. Every front office does.
And that's the juggling act for the front offices,
Yeah.
because, for the Giants in their position, they have so many needs that actually does come into play what you're talking about, right? Like where you have to be like, I'm evaluating the board and I'm weighing my risks based on what will be there at that position at another point. Because I always hear this around the Eagles, like Harry Roseman always talks about how he wants to be able to field his team tomorrow before the draft, go into the draft with your full team field. And it's like, yeah, that's cool, man. That's great. You're in a good position, Howie, where you've drafted so well and you've done so well managing this roster that you actually are in a position where you don't have to focus on need really at all in your draft. The Eagles simply don't have to draft for need. It's crazy, but they somehow don't have to draft for need. I can't think of one position where they're like dire at this point, which is in its own right disgusting and crazy, but the reality for us as Giants fans. But that's not easy to do. The Giants aren't that team. Like most of these teams can't do that. So that's the interesting part to me, the juggling act you just talked about, where like everyone says don't draft for need, and that's true. But at the same time, there is some level of need, and just more so like positional scarcity, right? And opportunity cost that does come into it for these GMs.
Well, that's why every NFL draft is unique in its own right, because every NFL draft is going to have different prospects. Every NFL team is going to value that prospect in a different manner. And I think that's one of the reasons why this is such a cool inexact science.
Yeah, and that's what makes it so fun. The draft is by far the coolest inexact science we have in this sport. And by far, to me, the most interesting thing about this sport in general. You have 7 rounds to build your roster out with guys that you feel can try to make your team better. So let's take a look now and transition a bit and go over Mocking the Mocks, a new segment we're coming up with. We'll probably do one of these a week going into the draft. This will be the first one where we just try to scour the internet and the media landscape for a bunch of different mocks and then mock them. And we're not going to mock them, actually. Nick and I aren't going to do that, but we're going to talk about them. We're going to discuss them. We're going to see where we think about them. So let's start with today's fresh off the press one from Todd McShay. Nick, do you know about that I had a little Twitter feud with Tom McShay back in the day? Did I ever tell you that?
No.
Oh, wow. This is like a classic joke in my Wisconsin group chat that they continue to pepper me with, and will never let it go, because a little while ago, it was during the 2018 draft. Todd McShay was associated with the agency. I think it was CAA or one of the agencies at the time. And he was pumping up the 2 quarterbacks who were associated with his agency. And so I just made a little tweet. I thought it was harmless at the time, saying it is interesting how Todd McShay is pumping up the 2 quarterbacks who are part of the agency that he just joined. And that led to some major backlash. McShay went off on that. I think one other guy in the media landscape, who I forget, like went off on that. And it was mostly a joke and in jest, but I can see looking back on it now, how maybe it's something I shouldn't have said, because it does in some ways paint McShay in not the greatest light if he's if I'm kind of insinuating that he's only ranking him. I didn't even say like he's only ranking. I just said, this is interesting, isn't it? Like, this is odd, like with the thinking emoji. And, it led to this whole thing. I'll be honest, though, straight up before that, this is partly probably why I made a comment like that towards somebody like him versus other people. I've never been a fan of McShay. I've always think he's kind of fake news type of draft analyst. Like I remember the one year he had like Jawan, who was the tackle that the Cardinals took in round 3 that was like ranked higher and had really good PFF grades. I don't know if he's even ended up working out in the NFL. He was from a small
school. About the kid from Houston.
Jones. Jones. I remember it was like funny during like Jones was getting all this buzz from like all the like film grinders who do the draft stuff, and like it's like McShay had like it was covering the Senior Bowl at the time, and it was like this is Todd McShay's 21st ranked tackle. And he like wasn't even on his board. Like just thought that was interesting to me. Just like I don't know with McShay. I'm personally not a huge fan of the way he does his draft content, but neither here nor there. I just want
Who are the quarterbacks though? Do you remember the quarterbacks?
the quarterbacks
What,
from
what,
the 20
what,
one was Josh Allen, which he was right about. He was definitely right on Josh Allen. What a lot of analysts were wrong on Josh Allen, including myself.
yeah.
He was definitely right on Josh Allen. And to this day, I have no regrets with that one. I don't mind missing on an outlier who had 55% completion rate at Wyoming or whatever it was. The guy was missing passes in the flat on film. You're watching him drill ball. But you know what? It has changed the whole way I evaluate quarterbacks now, because now I'm like too heavy on the traits. That like shell shocked me. I was like, oh my God, Josh Rosen didn't work out, but Josh Allen worked out. What am I missing with these guys? Oh, you got to look for the guys with traits and coaches can mold the next level. The problem with that is now you have to find the perfect coach with the quarterback, right? Because if Josh Allen doesn't get Brian Dable, is he even Josh Allen right now? Is he? I don't know.
I don't know.
That's the whole thing. Like, you can't guarantee the good coach. You can guarantee the traits, but you can't guarantee the coach. So anyway, it was Josh Allen, and the other one was one of the quarterbacks who didn't work out. It might have been Darnold. It wasn't Rosen. It wasn't Lamar. So I don't know. It was one of the other ones who didn't work out. It might even like one of the second rounders, but one of them was definitely Josh Allen.
That's awesome. Yeah, I had no idea that you had a Twitter feud with Todd McShay. Yeah. That's funny.
Yeah, I'm an idiot sometimes when it comes to Twitter. Just can't help myself, and it's weird. Twitter's what a weird place Twitter is, but I've gotten better over the years. Using the mute button has been the key to Twitter, I would say. And I told you about that once. I don't know if you're using it.
The mute button?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I'm now I know what the mute button is. I was unaware of it. I was like, wait, I can just mute people and not unfollow them. I'm like, wow, that's pretty cool. So there's a lot of annoying people on the timeline.
Yeah, it's the best, man. You just mute every troll and they're just talking into the ether then. All right, let's start to break down the mocks. We start with Todd McShay's mock. McShay's is interesting. It's fresh off the presses. And McShay has the Giants taking Emmanuel Forbes, the corner out of Mississippi State. He says, did you expect me to take a receiver? I nearly went with Jordan Addison here. So Jordan Addison was on the board. But he says, but there are other needs, including cornerback, and receiver can be just later in this class. Adoree Jackson, Darnay Holmes, Amanio, and Bobby McCain are under contract only through 2023. And the Giants tied the Raiders for the fewest interceptions in the NFL last season with 6. That's how many Forbes had on his own at Mississippi State in 22. And he picked off 14 passes over 3 seasons, including, and this is what I always hear when I hear the Forbes evals, the 6 pick sixes. He had 6 pick sixes. Forbes is lean at 6'1" and 166 pounds, but he has great size and fantastic instincts in coverage. The Giants blitz more than any team last season, but didn't have any ball hawks in the secondary to take advantage. Forbes would feast on mistakes forced by that pressure. My initial thought, let's get your initial thoughts on this, Nick, and then I'll go into mine.
I think he's onto something, and I haven't watched Emmanuel Forbes yet. I just got done watching Cam Smith yesterday, who I really liked. I think I'm going to like Forbes. I don't want to go into that evaluation thinking that, right? So I'm trying to take that out of my mind, but he's really onto something in terms of how much the Giants blitz and how the Giants need cornerbacks with ball skills who can come away with these takeaways and who can hang in man coverage. So I'm really pumped to actually watch this evaluation. But as you see on the screen right now, this is somebody who is 0 percentile. If you're watching on YouTube, he is the lowest in terms of his weight. Now, the Giants overlooked that with Cordell Flott, and we made a big deal about it. We're like, man, they took Cordell Flott. That's a 3rd-round pick. We're talking about at pick 25 right here. I'll tell you one thing, though, because I started watching a little bit of Emmanuel Forbes, and I'm nearly done with his evaluation yet. But he had a play against Will Levis in Kentucky where it was a 4th and 2, and Kentucky ran a screen. This was one of his 6 pick sixes. They ran a screen, and the wide receiver who Forbes was responsible for was the receiver who was going underneath the offensive lineman for the screen, and Forbes read it like that. He anticipated it. He took the angle to where the wide receiver would be catching the football, cut off the throw, intercepted it, took it to the house. That showed a lot of instinct. So as long as this guy has the coverage ability that, at least that I hear, that he possesses, and he's not a complete liability in terms of his physicality, I think I am going to like him, but I'll wait till the end of the week and then I'll probably report back on that because he's an interesting player for sure. But I don't hate the idea of this from Todd McShay.
And Todd McShay, I got to give you credit where credit's due. This was pretty damn good analysis. I like the points you made about how few players are under contract for the Giants at corner, which we've talked about, but is really important. And I like the point you made about how often the Giants blitz, how important it is to what they are schematically. They're a blitz first team. And then how much nice it might be to have one of these ball hawk types in the secondary. And I haven't watched any film yet on Forbes, Nick, but I've watched highlights before this podcast. And then one thing I thought was really interesting about watching him was that he has this tendency sometimes on these interceptions to freelance, but it's like smart, nuanced freelancing. Like every time he does it, it's like, yeah, that was the right decision. And that was a good decision. And I think that's something that could be tricky for the next level. Like for coaches, they might not like that in his game, or they might be like, this is why he's the type of guy who had 6 pick six. I mean, look, the Giants secondary needs playmakers from an interception standpoint. They need guys who have ball skills. And I love ball skills in general when evaluating these corners because it's not something you always see. Corners and safeties, it's not something you always see. It's something I really liked about Antoine Winfield's game 2 years ago when he came out, and I really wanted the Giants to get him. I'm happy they got McKinney anyway, another player who was great. But Winfield was something that stood out to me from his tape at Minnesota. And so I like the idea of getting a ball skills guy, Nick. I like the idea of somebody, obviously he has the speed. You showed it there. You can see it right there on the screen. 92nd percentile 10-yard split here. 97th percentile 40-yard dash. Those are unbelievable numbers. He's an explosive athlete. He's fast. I am very worried, Nick, though, about the frame. 6'1", 166. Like you said, 0 percentile. That scares me a bit. And I don't know if there is any physicality to his game. I haven't watched enough of his film. I've just seen highlights, like I said. But would the Giants be interested in that type of player? Last year's draft, like you said, with Cordell Flott suggests that they might be. They might be the type of team that throws out these thresholds, these height weight type thresholds. And so if that's the case, he could be definitely someone on the radar. And I'm with you. I wouldn't hate this kind of pick because if they make this pick, it's obviously someone Wink Martindale specifically wants for his system, right? Like I can trust Wink Martindale in this spot. And so yeah, it's someone who's interesting. Do you think he has? I mean, you would probably think if they draft him, they think he has a little bit more room to grow in his frame with his frame, right? Like they don't expect him to play at 166 at the NFL level.
I would hope not. No, his like lower body is really skinny. It's really thin looking. He's high cut as well, so it's like no, just like his lower body is just like it's frail looking.
Yeah,
like his calves are very very skinny, and that's one thing I look at and I'm like, damn, dude, that's a little bit concerning. But I'll have to watch all the tape, and then, like I said before, I will report back. But I'll say this, man, he passed on Deonte Banks. Deonte Banks on this mock draft was still on the board, and that's one where I was like, okay, maybe he knows something I don't. So let's get into this tape. Let's get into this Emmanuel Forbes film, and let's see if he's better than Deonte Banks.
He also passed on Michael Mayer, the tight end out of Notre Dame, who I like a lot. I like Michael Mayer quite a bit. Like I would be, if the Giants said we want Michael Mayer and we take Michael Mayer at 25, I'd be like, okay, cool. Like to me, I'm excited about that. Like I know they have Waller, I know they have Daniel Bellinger, players we like, but Michael Mayer is smooth out there, man, and he covers ground and he does things that someone his size shouldn't be doing from a movement skill standpoint, and catches everything that's thrown at him. And has a huge catch radius. Like a player like Michael Mayer to me would, especially if we're running some of that same stuff where we're under center and we're running the boot action stuff with those tight ends leaking out. Like he to me seems like a guy who could be a weapon. And I feel like he has a frame that he's not going to be like an amazing blocker at the next level. It's not George Kittle or anything, but I think he has the frame to be a pretty solid blocker too. So they passed on him, Michael Mayer. I know we haven't had a chance to discuss him much. I would love to do at some point, Nick, some profiles on those tight ends, though, because I love this tight end class. I know the Giants don't really need one, but still think there could be some opportunities BPA there. He also passed on Jordan Addison, who we just discussed profile on. What are your thoughts on that?
That's something that's interesting. But again, we think cornerback is the biggest need here. So if cornerback's the biggest need, and if Emmanuel Forbes checks out in terms of his traits and what he does on the football field, then it's not that big of a surprise.
Yep. And a couple of
we know the Giants are interested, though. The Giants are interested in Jordan Addison. I mean, they're bringing him in. They're whining and dining him, I think, as well. I'm not sure if they took him out to dinner, but I believe he's coming in for a top 30 visit. So they have a lot of interest in Addison. They're definitely alive and well in the wide receiver market.
Jordan Addison is coming in for a top 30 visit. And one thing we plan to do on the Big Blue Banter podcast this week or the next one is break down the top 30 visits for the Giants so far, break down the players who have gotten these top 30 visits. They're not the be-all, end-all, but the Giants did draft 3 players. 3 of their what they had last year, 9 draft picks. What did they draft last? 7, 8, 9? I can't remember.
I believe it was either 9 or 10, but regardless of the fact, also a lot of those top 30 visits last year was a different draft. The Giants had 2 top 10 picks. Right. So a lot of them was Trayvon Walker, Aiden Hutchinson, Sauce Gardner. They brought in a lot of players who they were going to have to entertain given the different scenarios that were going to happen through the first 4 picks of the draft. Whereas this year, they're picking 25. So they're going to bring in more guys on those top 30 visits, a wider variety of places where these guys will be selected this year, I think.
And in that sense, they could be even more interested in drafting the players this year than they were last year because, like you said, they had to do their due diligence on all the top guys. So, regardless, there were 3 players selected from the private top 30 visits last year, which is a high number, 3 of 10. And again, it could be even bigger number this year. So, we're going to talk about that on another podcast. But in Todd McShay's mock, a couple interesting takeaways. Jalen Hyatt did not go in round one. Osiris Torres, who a lot of people think is the best interior offensive lineman in this class, or at least the best non-Skoronski, if they're going to move him there. If people are saying he has to move, even though I think he can play tackle probably. And that's also another player who's not in the first round. Were you surprised by either of those two things?
No, I'm not surprised if Jalen Hyatt falls out of the first round. And Osiris Torrance, I mean, I think he's talented enough to go in the first round from everything that I've seen. But if he falls out, I wouldn't be shocked either.
Okay. And then in the second round, McShay comes back after getting Emmanuel Forms, gets another small player. So the Giants take I don't even know. I think this guy is, I don't know the exact height weight on this guy, but definitely 2 sub 200, maybe 2 sub 190 type players where they take wide receiver Josh Downs out of North Carolina. And I haven't watched film on Josh Downs yet, Nick, but I have seen a lot of Josh Downs because I bet Drake May every single week for the last 9 weeks of the season last year in North Carolina. And I watched a ton of North Carolina last year. And I loved Josh Downs just from that standpoint. I don't know if the film checks out, and I don't know if he can on a consistent level. And the projection is the most important thing here. And obviously, you can see Nick pulled up Josh Downs' mock draftable here. So you can kind of see the numbers. 93rd percentile 10-yard split stands out. You can see that explosiveness in his film and that quickness. Fast player. I feel like in a lot of ways, he's kind of like a Jordan Addison light almost in some ways to me. Or at least maybe like a Zay Flowers, all similar mold as those types of receivers. What are your thoughts on that pick?
I have to evaluate Josh Downs still. Everything I've seen, I think I'm going to absolutely love this player, but he's very undersized. He's more of a slot guy. Like you can see here, sub 5'10, about 171 pounds, limited catch radius. Again, similar to Wan'Dale Robinson. I feel like Wan'Dale Robinson might be a little bit more physical. But the thing that's interesting about Josh Downs is this is somebody who last season, this guy commanded the catch point. And I could pull it up here on Pro Football Focus whenever I get a chance, but he had like a ridiculously high contested catch win rate. For somebody who is 5'9", 170 pounds, he was playing like Quentin Johnston should be playing. Right. And he possesses all those short area quickness, understands how to run routes, beautiful micro movements throughout his stem. I really appreciate the little bit of film that I have watched from Josh Downs and the highlights that I have seen, a lot of those being contested catch type of highlights. But I will be writing an evaluation on him shortly as well, because I think he's a really good wide receiver that not a lot of people are discussing right now.
That's a really good point too, because just thinking back to what I've seen of him, he was utilized in the red zone. He was effective in the red zone. And you're right, he does play much bigger than his size on those contested catch 50-50 situation. That's just a skill set you can have. Like, you don't have to be the biggest guy in the world. The best contested catch receiver I've seen in the last decade in the NFL was DeAndre Hopkins, who's what, like 6'1"? He can't be much taller than 6'1", DeAndre Hopkins. He's smaller than you would think, but it doesn't matter. He's like, the height doesn't play a role there. He's just, like you said, amazing at that. Scroll up a little bit on that. I want to see the full spider chart there for Josh Downs. So yeah, you can see from this full spider chart, this is an insanely explosive athlete, which is shown by the vert and broad jumps. The 40-yard dash is probably not what he hoped it would be, but he looks faster on film and he has game speed, in my opinion, especially on those vert routes. Like Nick said, he has a lot of good micro movements. I've never heard that term before, but I like that one. And then also the 10-yard split shows kind of that acceleration and that quickness. This is a good receiver, and if he's dropping around too, I'd be perfectly happy with the Giants taking him.
Yeah, Dan, I think I would be okay with that as well. But I will say this is another second round, really small
yes.
wide receiver. I think I do prefer, and again, I haven't watched all of his tape, but the profile that I believe Josh Downs possesses from what I've seen so far tells me that I'm going to like him more than I liked Wan'Dale Robinson coming out last year.
I feel the exact same way about that, Nick. Like, to a point, the exact same way. Wan'Dale Robinson's not the type of receiver I would probably draft, in my opinion, personally. I understand why they did it, but I completely agree with you. Josh Downs is more of a vertical component to his game, much better contested catch receiver, and I still think he can do a lot of the short area stuff that Wan'Dale does anyway. Maybe he's not going to be the guy who motions into the backfield for you, but other than that, I think, and maybe he's not really the biggest. He's not the same as Wan'Dale from that twitchiness in open space, but I agree with you. This is definitely a profile I'd rather invest in.
All right, think of Jackson Smith-Njigba.
Mm-hmm.
Josh Downs isn't as big. He's maybe not quite as physical, not as precise as a route runner, but he is like a little bit of a poor man's version of what Jackson Smith and Jigba can offer you in the first round. And you can get Josh Downs a little bit later. He's just smaller, but in terms of just how he wins over the middle of the field and how smart he is running routes, from what I've seen so far, that's what Josh Downs is going to offer a team, in my opinion, from the film I've seen.
And I'm so excited that you mentioned that because it just in my head, I'm just churning in a different direction. I'm just thinking about that offense because I love any offense that utilizes receivers in that way on those types of routes. And that offensive coordinator, Phil Longo of North Carolina, is now the offensive coordinator of the Wisconsin Badgers. So I'm just thinking of the new offense, dude. I've been in a crazy offense for my whole life at Wisconsin. We've been a run pass almost exclusively. I mean, to a T. We are the first down you run, second down you run, third down, if you really have to pass, you pass. But if it's 3rd and 4 shorter, you're running again. This is the type of offense I lived in. So now I'm finally going to get to see an offense where you have like whip routes in the middle of the field and different things to create separation on quick hitters. So I'm excited to see it. And I'm excited to watch Josh Downs too, because then I'll get to see a little bit more Phil Longo. But let's take a look at another mock draft. This one's from Pete Prisco, CBS Sports, colleague of mine. And Pete Prisco has the Giants with their first round pick selecting John Michael Schmitz, the center out of Minnesota. He says they have a need at center, and Schmitz is considered the best of a good class. They could go corner here, maybe Emmanuel Forbes or Cam Smith, both of who were on the board at the time, but they opt. So I guess Deonte Banks is not, and it looks like he's not. But they opt to help out Daniel Jones instead and the offensive line. This is also interesting. I like how with the CBS Sports mocks, and no, I'm not just saying this because I work for the company. They do a prospect rank and the position rank for each player. So despite them mocking Schmitz here and them saying that he's considered the best in the class, the CBS Sports and I believe the people who go into the ranking are Ryan Wilson, Chris Trapasso, Pete Prisca, and a few others. They have him ranked 51st overall as a prospect, Schmitz, in this class, and the 3rd best center. So I thought that was interesting too. But they have John Michael Schmitz here. It's a 1-round mock from Pete.
That is interesting. I'm wondering why they had the Giants going John Michael Schmitz if he is their 3rd center. Because to me, he's my number 1 center. But I look at Joe Tippmann and I'm like, I can see why Bobby Johnson and Brian Dable may prefer the upside of Joe Tippmann with his just overall athletic ability, body control, and how he really kicks out into space to a player like John Michael Schmitz, who can do that, but I don't feel like he can do it to the level that Joe Tippmann can offer. And like I said, Dan and I, we have a podcast coming out shortly on this extensively. We recorded it earlier in the week. But that's kind of where I'm at in terms of the ceiling floor argument in relation to the New York Giants when it comes to Joe Tippmann, because he can kick out into space. So he was the best power gap or interior offensive lineman that I think I've seen so far. And I know he only played like 10 snaps, I think, at guard in his freshman season. You can correct me if I'm wrong. He's been a center the last 2 years.
Yep.
But I think there could be a possibility that he could at least move to guard. He's only 22 years old, whereas John Michael Schmitz is 24, and he's a player who is going to more than likely just operate at center.
Right. And that's kind of the discussion point there the entire time. And I think for what answer your first question on why that was the case, I think the way that they do it here is they try to predict what will happen, not what they would do in that spot.
Gotcha. All right.
Yeah. So it's one of those mocks. And I think a lot of the mocks you'll see are like that. I know Jeremiah's are like that too. So it's kind of more of what they're hearing and what they're expecting the pick to be. So now we have Ryan Wilson's 3-round mock draft, because Ryan Wilson, who also works for CBS Sports, does a couple 3-rounders. This one was interesting. With the first pick, he has the Giants taking Deonte Banks, the corner out of Maryland, who I know you love, Nick, and he would love for him to fall to 25. I know you also think it's probably not likely that he does, which is sad to hear. And then he has Steve Avila, and I don't know if I'm saying that right, but the TCU interior offensive lineman with their 2nd-round pick. And then Keaton Mitchell at running back with their 3rd-round pick. So I loved how this thing started, Nick, with Deonte Banks. I didn't really love how it continued. I really wouldn't love Steve Avila there at 57, and I definitely would not like Keaton Mitchell there at 30 in the 3rd round. Look, I see the appeal to Keaton Mitchell, but he's got that game-changing speed, but he is so undersized, and there are so many running backs who I like more than him who are going to be selected 50, 100, 150 picks after this spot with Keaton Mitchell. So I would be pretty sad. The Keaton Mitchell one in round 3 would be probably the worst one for me.
I wouldn't hate Steve Avila, whatever it is right now, Dan, at 57. I wouldn't, because that's somebody who has played all across the TCU line. He was the best offensive lineman out there for TCU. I think when I did his evaluation, he wasn't as mobile as some of these other interior offensive linemen that we are discussing, but I ended up liking his film. I did that like maybe 3 months ago. It should be over there at Giants Country if anybody wants to check it out. But he seemed like a pretty squared away type of prospect. I don't think the Giants would be able to get him in the third round. That's why I'm like, okay, second round, if they really believe in his skill set, let's solidify that interior offensive line and see if he can actually play center, which he has at the college level, even though he was a guard last year. And then I'm right there with Keaton Mitchell. Man, Keaton Mitchell, just incredibly exciting running back at a small school, was running all over the place for ECU against like Old Dominion and teams like Memphis and plays like that. I mean, I think he tracked 21.8 miles per hour, which is pretty damn fast.
Oh, yeah.
But you're right. Undersized type of player in the third round. There's probably at least a slew of other running backs that I've seen that I would entertain in the third round. Keaton Mitchell, it's just a little bit too rich for me.
Yeah, I love adding speed, but there's so many different ways you can do that in this draft that are going to be, later, or in some ways, maybe you have to take some of them earlier. Like A-Chain is a player I really like, and I think he could add an element of speed to any offense. And immediately that pony package the Giants had, like, that's the thing with running backs, why I'm so excited about hopefully drafting one this year. Yeah, they have Saquon Barkley, but you're looking about ways to improve the offense and add explosion to the skill positions and add different types of playmakers. And in this class, a lot of those guys are at the running back position. Like some of these guys, A-Chain, Mitchell's another one of them, which just he brings a different level of speed to the offense. But like you said, there's just so many good running backs in this class. Like you're going to tell me you're going to take Keaton Mitchell in round 3, but then Roschon Johnson's just going to be hanging on the board for another 50 picks like he likely will be. Like that's just going to piss me off during the draft if they use that third round premium capital at running back. And it's not even the guy I think is the best player to take at the time. And there's going to be like more than just Roschon Johnson, I think, at the time. Like my guess is Kendry Miller, who we love, is probably not gonna go before that third round pick either, just based on his profile and what I've heard, the buzz with those types of players. So I don't know. I would be pretty disappointed in that last one, but Avia is definitely an interesting one. I haven't watched much, but love the idea of investing in interior offensive line. 57 is fine for me at that point. Then you're not really using premium capital anymore.
Yeah, Tajee Spears from Tulane is another player to consider. He might be gone by that third round pick. And then Israel, the Pitt running back, Israel Abanikanda.
Yeah.
He's another one that is very explosive, very quick, home run hitting type of back, much better version from what I've seen of a Keaton Mitchell. And I think he should be available around that third round selection.
Yeah, good point. And you can even throw another track athlete in there, but even though he's a much bigger guy, he packs a much bigger punch. But Sean Tucker out of Syracuse is another guy who ran track for them. Like he has track level speed there. And it was like 270. He might be in the 220s too, or close to 220. He's a really interesting prospect. A lot of people really like him. I think his game is interesting because he's really more of that, like, get the ball and get vertical and just go straight forward into people. I don't think he has much wiggle to his game, which depends if you care about that or not. I guess fits certain types of offenses, certain types of offenses it might not. But if you're looking for just that speed and that level of explosion, he also offers it. And he honestly, with his injury profile, he might be available too in that spot.
He might be.
Yeah. All right. Let's look at another mock draft here where the Giants, this one is also, we'll pass this Ryan Wilson one. He had another one that came out. He's doing like insane amounts of mock drafts. CBS Sports, like he had the 3-round mock, and like a day later, he had another 1-round mock. And this one, he goes with John Michael Schmitz again. So we'll pass that one. We'll go to Lance Zierlein's newest mock, where he has the Giants selecting safety out of Alabama,